Slow stitching can seem complicated, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to show 5 different techniques for creating beautiful color and texture, including various ways to use the seed stitch and French knots. I'm also going to draw on previous projects to give you ideas about what to make with your stitched creation. It all starts with a fabric collage and some colorful floss, and then the stitching can begin. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. So here are some fabric and floss colors that I've pulled as inspiration for creating this fabric collage. And I've begun to cut some of them up and place them on a base. The base that I'm working with here is felt, and the size I'm working with is about 5 1/4 inches by 13 inches or 13 by 33 centimeters. You can do this in any size that you choose. So I have placed white fabric over top of my felt and then some pale pink fabric in several spots over top of that, and then I've begun to build my collage. So now that I have these first few pieces, I'm going to bring in more fabrics and continue to place them on top and move them around until I'm happy with the layout. Now, if you want to see how I create a fabric collage, you can take a look at this video and I'll provide a link. And that video provides a step-by-step about how I get to this point. So this is the collage that I've created. You can baste the collage pieces down using pins. You can also baste them down with sewing thread. And that's all covered in the video that I've referenced. So my collage is basted down with thread, so it's not going to be moving around as I begin to work. So my next step is to choose floss colors, and I'm going to choose them based on the colors of my fabrics. So I've pulled out this dark purple, and then I've chosen a lighter version of that purple. And then I'm going to bring out some pinks in a dark and a light shade. And I'm also going to choose several shades of blue, some that have more purple in them, like this lavender blue, and some with more green. And then 3 different shades of green, going from light to dark. I'm also bringing out a yellow shade that's going to match with the gold in some of these fabrics. So that brings me to the first technique, which is color. These colors can be used to create all kinds of interesting effects. The floss can match the fabric when you stitch, or it can contrast with the color of the fabric. And used in combination, the colors you choose can really add to the overall effect of your slow stitched piece. The second technique is surrounding each piece of fabric with stitch. Stitching each collage piece down by surrounding them with stitches. You can choose a matching or a contrasting color of thread. You can place the stitches close together or not at all. It's completely up to you. So I've begun doing this, and I'm using just straight stitches. And I'm going to continue to surround each collage piece. So I'll meet you back here when I've done that. Take a look at how this has already added so much to the collage. I've used a combination of matching and contrasting colors to surround each patchwork piece, and I'm happy with the effects that it's creating. Next, I'm going to begin moving back and forth between different techniques where I'll be adding stitching over top of each piece of patchwork. So the first one is the running stitch. Adding the running stitch in a contrasting color over solid fabrics or pattern fabrics, especially where the pattern fabrics aren't a design that you particularly want to highlight, is a great choice to add texture and color and to unite the differing pieces of collage. So I have begun to add some running stitches, and now I'm going to hop to the next technique, and that is adding seed stitches. So one way to use the seed stitch is to stitch around the design on the fabric. You can choose a color that matches, or a color that contrasts. And each one will give a different effect. So you can surround the design without stitching over it. So in this case, there's this flower design, and I can stitch all around the flower without touching it at all, or by stitching strategically to highlight that flower design. So I'm going to choose a color that I think is going to stand out. It's this lavender blue, and that color is in this piece of fabric, and it's going to highlight the purples. So I'm going to go all around this flower, outlining it. So I've gone around once and stitched the outline of this flower, and it's not really standing out yet, but I'm going to continue going around and around, following this pattern of outlining the flower, and see what kind of results I get. So here you can see the results. It's really highlighted that flower, and it's taken the background and unified it and pushed everything back so that flower really stands out. So this outlining technique can be really effective. I'm going to bring out my journal cover that I stitched in a previous video, and if you want to see how this came together, I'll link to that video as well. So I've used this technique in several spots on this journal cover. In this leaf design in this piece of fabric, I've used several different colors to outline these red leaf shapes. I haven't actually stitched on the leaves themselves and only surrounded it, and it's caused those leaves to really stand out. I also use that technique down here in this small piece of fabric with these pink leaf shapes. I stitched around the leaves and the stems and only added stitching to the background. With this central fuchsia pink leaf, I stitched all around the leaf and also on top of the leaf. So depending on your design, you can choose how much stitching you want to add to highlight the pattern on the fabric. There are lots of options, and you can take your cues from the colors and design that are in the fabric. So I added some stitching in purple over this flower design, and I'm happy with the results that I've gotten there. Now over on this other piece, I've begun to surround this flower shape with the golden yellow color. And that color is a really big contrast to the colors that are going on in the piece. So that's going to give a very different effect than what I've done here with the lavender blue. In this floral piece, I've also used the seed stitching technique. And I've surrounded those purple flowers and not stitched on them, but used that same color that's in the flower in the areas that are white. So now I'm going to come back to this piece where I've been stitching in the gold and show how I create this seed stitch. So I'm stitching on the top here, meaning I'm not pulling my thread all the way to the back and bringing it to the front. But either technique will work. So you can pull it all the way to the back like I'm doing here. This is a stab stitch approach. Both techniques give the same effect. So choosing which way to do it, whether you're working back to front or you're working on the top, is really a preference. And I do both. So I'm going to continue to fill out this area with these golden yellow stitches. So here are the results I've gotten by filling in this area. These stitches are really standing out. It's giving a very different effect than I have over here. So now I'm going to come in and add some stitches to the flower like I did on the purple one and see the results that I get from doing that. So here I've come in with the two colors, the greenish blue and the purple, and I've added stitching to the flower. So you can see in these three different areas using the seed stitch, the completely different effects that you can get. It's a really versatile stitch that adds so much. The next technique I'm going to talk about are French knots. You can add French knots in areas where you're not going to be adding heavy stitching, or you can even add French knots to highlight the pattern in the fabric or other stitching that you've done. So I've begun to add French knots on this gold and purple fabric, and I've chosen to use a golden yellow color. So this is a very subtle effect where the French knots aren't standing out. and I've used the pattern on the fabric as my guide for where to place the French knots. French knots are a really effective mark to make to highlight your fabric collage. I'm going to bring out my Crazy Quilt inspired journal cover again to show the different ways that I used French knots. So here I've placed a cluster of French knots, which add so much color and texture. Here I dotted the French knots around the piece, and it's surrounding some seed stitches. So this small patch has a combination of both stitches, and they work really well together. Down here, I've placed a line of French knots, and it's in a contrasting color. So it's adding quite a lot to the other stitching that I have going on that small piece. I added French knots all over this piece, in a contrasting color along trims, in a complementary color here, in orange to highlight what's going on in the fabric. There's so many options for what you can do with French knots. So I'm going to continue to add French knots on this piece and see the different effects that I can get. I want to talk about choosing needles for French knots. Sometimes the right needle can really make a difference. So normally I stitch with embroidery needles, and that's what I've been using here so far. So these embroidery needles you can use in a pinch to make French knots because the eye isn't too large. But to make beautiful, crisp French knots, I like to switch to using a Milliners needle. The difference here is that the shaft and the eye are the same size. So when you're pulling your needle through, creating the French knot, you don't have that resistance of that larger, wider eye. And you can get Milliners needles in a set in the same sizes of your embroidery needles. These two sets are sizes 3 to 9, and they work really well for the type of stitching that I'm doing here, where I'm using 2 strands of floss to create all my stitching, including French knots. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do a French knot in case you want a refresher, or if you're brand new to creating French knots. So you pull your thread through, you bring out the tip of your needle, and you wind your thread around it 3 times or more. The more times you wind it, the larger your knot's going to be. And then you put your needle back down right beside where you came out. And you pull that knot that you've created, you pull it tight and bring it right down to the base where you're going back in. I often use a finger to hold that knot in place, and then I pull my thread all the way through, and that creates the knot. I'll do it one more time here. You pull your thread through from the back to the front. You take your thread and you wind it around the needle 3 times or more. You go back down right beside where you came out. You push your needle in. You pull that thread tight, bring that knot all the way down to the base. Hold it in place. And then pull that thread all the way through. And then you have a French knot. You can place these very close together. You can place them far apart. There's so many options. So I'm going to add French knots here over top of the purple in this contrasting blue color. So these ones are going to stand out. They're going to add texture and color. So I have added French knots to this second area where I have this gold stitching. And this time I've used a contrasting color. Look how pretty this lavender blue color looks up against the gold and the purple. I've used the fabric as my guide in placing all of these French knots, and it's added such beautiful texture. So this stands out much more than the golden yellow that I've used on the other piece. So that just shows how important choosing the right color of floss is and the different effects that they create. So now I'm going to continue, and I'm going to use all these techniques in combination. I'm going to add the running stitches, the seed stitches, and French knots. And I'm going to remember color, where I'm going to try and match the color at times and contrast the color at other times. And I'm going to cover the entire piece. So now all of my stitching is complete. Let's take a look at the different techniques used in the different areas. I've added seed stitches in matching and contrasting colors, and I love the different effects that they've created. I've also added French knots to that third piece with the gold, and I've chosen green, and that's given a completely different effect. Each one I really like. I've added running stitches all over the piece. I've used a lot of my darkest turquoise color for the running stitches because it really stands out. I'm really happy with the effects that I've got here. All of this stitching has really unified all these different colors and shapes and brought them together as one piece. So now you might be asking, now that I have a stitched piece of fabric, what can I make with it? Well, there are so many options. Now this piece that I've stitched is rectangular. So this could be turned into a journal cover, like the one that I've shown previously, my Crazy Quilt inspired. What I did is I added lining and some pockets for my book to fit into. So you can take a look at that video and see how I did that. Another option with a rectangular piece that you've stitched is to create a needle book. So I'll link to the video where I made this needle book. I added a lining on this one and brought the lining fabric to the front and created a binding. So take a look at that video if you want to see how I did that. I also stitched in some pages made of felt to create the inside of the needle book. And that was a really fun project. I also have a video where I made another needle book, and this one is slightly different. This one has a button closure, and instead of having pages inside this book, I have a pocket on one side and some wool on the other for pins and needles. And I'll link to that project as well if you want to see that come together. You can even make a bag or a drawstring pouch. As for this piece that I have here, I have another idea about what I'm going to do with this. And that's going to be the topic of my next video. I'm going to take this piece and turn it into something completely different. So I hope the ideas that I've provided here have given you a framework on how to approach a slow stitched project and how you can take different pieces of fabric and really bring it all together to make something beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, happy stitching.